Welcome to episode number 3 of Man in the Arena Election Preview Edition. I am Jonah Schultz. Predictions, potential fallout, and more coming your way. But first, reminder, you can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Good Pods, or wherever you get your podcasts. Check us out on Facebook, X, Instagram, TikTok, Truth Social, and YouTube at Man in the Arena PC. Make sure you're subscribing on YouTube. That's the only place you can find our video podcast. Now let's go.
Tear down this wall. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
So as you know by now, the name of this show is Man in the Arena. And if you listen to episode number 1 of this show, I went through all of the reasons why this name was chosen for this time and for this moment. And if you've never read the speech by Teddy Roosevelt, I would encourage you to do so. And I would really pray that his words lift you up like they have done many times throughout my life. But as you look at our world today, regardless of your political beliefs, your ideology, or your personal opinions, who would you truly say in this moment is the singular man in the arena? If you are an objective and a fair-minded individual, there is really no question that your answer to that question would be Donald Trump. If you have followed me over my time in politics or social media or on this show, you've heard me be critical of Donald Trump on a variety of policy issues ranging from the COVID lockdowns to the First Step Act. I have qualms with Donald Trump, maybe like some of you do. And when it comes to his record and performance in his first 4-year term, there leaves some things to be desired. But there are times in history when the necessity of a political figure cannot be measured in policy. When George Washington steadied our infant nation and helped ensure the true success of our revolution, he, of course, did so with the help of law and policy. But do we believe that his impact on America can be measured by acts of Congress signed into law? When Abraham Lincoln quite literally saved our union from destruction, he of course used law and policy to some degree, but it was not simply his political aptitude that cemented his place as one of the most crucial figures in world history. There are times when men come along who, for some, at times indescribable reasons, feel made for the moment, simply irreplaceable and oftentimes unlikely figures. A president like Joe Biden or George W. Bush, they are as likely figures as they come. And while they have achieved great success in their own personal political endeavors, they will really become nothing more than footnotes in history with no true lasting impact. And while there are many people like myself who may not love Donald Trump or align 100% with his policies, there's something about him that feels made for this. From his confrontation with the media establishment, a near successful attempt on his life, and a simply incredible appearance working the drive-thru at McDonald's, Donald Trump has seized his moment. Now, I don't know what the next 4 years will hold if Donald Trump wins. I will await with some optimism on many of his promises on immigration and other America First initiatives, but I understand, and you should understand, that politicians, even those who are seemingly great, will almost always let you down. But I do know exactly what the next 4 years will hold with a Kamala Harris presidency, because we have been living it for 3.5 years, and it will only get worse. So the question, once again, comes back to this. Who are we as Americans? Or better yet, who do we want to be? Will we seize this moment? Trump has never been the answer to all of our problems, but a Donald Trump victory shows the world that the light of liberty in our hearts, the hearts of the American people, has not been put out just yet. Now, let's get into today's calibration. All right, I am back here at the desk with Ken Hendrickson Jr.
Happy Election Eve.
Happy Election Eve as well. The illustrious Ken Hendrickson Jr. back at it with me today. Third time in a row. Still haven't scared him off yet. We'll do it one of these days. But before we get into our predictions, before we get into the state of the race, what we're looking at here, there is a story I really want to cover because I think it's really telling about where we are at with American politics, where we are at with our two parties, where we are at globally in our political climate. I don't think there's any argument that our politics has become more and more of a globalist endeavor. I don't think before in human history really have you seen nations interacting with one another and others. Elections, interfering is a word that's used a lot. You see presidents going over to other countries. You saw Joe Biden campaigning for other presidents in the past. You've seen this happening on a larger and larger scale. And I think it's really something that's pretty unhealthy and telling that we are moving more and more and towards more of what you would look at as that one world government, where all of these governments are working in conjunction with one another, not just in some sort of mutual agreement or through treaties or through any of these things, but working together in a way that it forms a single unit to essentially lord over all of the peoples of the earth, which is something that has been warned against from the beginning of time for a special reason. But the story I wanted to get into that I think is being a little bit underreported on is that the British Labour Party, which recently took control in the United Kingdom, is sending staff to campaign for Harris in U.S. swing states. This is an NBC News article. The left-leaning British Labour Party is sending nearly 100 members to U.S. battleground states to campaign for Vice President Kamala Harris ahead of the presidential election. Now, before I get into the substance of this, I think it's important to always point out the fact that, could you imagine? I hate when Republicans do this because it's usually from the standpoint of, could you imagine if the Democrats did this? And then we never actually do anything about it. But could you imagine if Republicans had, I don't know, maybe some Israeli politicians coming in to campaign for them around the country, or God forbid, Russian politicians or Ukrainian or whatever country it was. If you had, we spent the last decade really talking about the fact that, oh, the Russians are interfering in U.S. elections, that the Republicans are dependent on U.S. or foreign election interference to win elections. It's swaying voters, it's misinformation, it's this and that. So we know the response would be, and it's always a double standard. There's that great saying that if Democrats didn't have double standards, they wouldn't have any standards at all. And this is yet another pointing to that truth. But the fact that a party in the United States would turn to a foreign entity and say, we want you to come over here and campaign for us. And you have the other party that is essentially running on the slogan "America First." I don't think, from an illustrative standpoint, I don't think you could point to a greater dichotomy than one party is using literally foreign labor to push their agenda, try to push them across the finish line in these swing states, and one party is saying we're the America First party. What are your thoughts on this, Ken?
I think it's interesting. You kind of brought up like, what if the Republicans did this? I was just thinking about like when Netanyahu was here for to address a joint session of Congress. Like, it was even hard to get Democrats in the hall.
Yeah,
it's like that wasn't a campaign event or anything. So,
right.
I guess my question is, and I think the Trump campaigns, I think, has already filed an FEC complaint against this in terms of like foreign interference in the election. I guess my question is like, are Americans taking Labor Party affiliates coming over here talking about Harris Walz like seriously? Like, are we? I guess as Americans, like, are we at a point where we're listening to people from another country talk about our politics? Like, I would hope that would ring hollow with a lot of American voters.
Yeah, I would hope that. And also, if I'm a tax-paying citizen of the United Kingdom, I'm ticked off by this, that I am footing the bill to go influence another election, right?
Sure.
If we were sending folks, which I know we have done, across to influence other elections, I'd be ticked about that, because that's a sovereign nation. One, we don't have the right to manipulate their elections, which is essentially what this is trying to do. There's this great CNN article. You can always count on them for some great headlines, but it's Trump ignites spat with U.S. ally accusing UK's governing party of election interference. So it's funny that the UK sending over officials to influence our election isn't what ignites the spat. It's Trump getting upset about it, right? It always comes. It's like that Republicans pounce, right? Republicans are upset about this. Why could they possibly be upset? But it kind of reminds me a little bit about the Alien and Sedition Acts going back to our early republic. This was taking place during the French Revolution, and something that John Adams is possibly most known for during his presidency was the Alien Sedition Acts, and we point to it as the jailing of journalists and the infringement on freedom of speech and all of those different things. But I think sometimes what gets lost in this, and in defense of what was done at this point, is this was really an attempt ultimately to avoid foreign influence in our affairs. And I think sometimes as Republicans, as conservatives, as libertarians, and I always talk about myself as kind of a recovering libertarian because that was my viewpoint on a lot of things for a long time, we forget that sometimes governing does need to take place. Sometimes there are things that need to be dealt with from a government standpoint. And my belief is that if you had the government come in right now and say, we're going to expel these individuals who are trying to influence our elections from a foreign standpoint, I don't believe there would be anything unconstitutional or wrong or immoral about that. And going even deeper into this issue, we can focus on this at hand, these 100 Labor Party representatives, but we've also seen increasing in nature the foreign funding of our elections. Right here in Ohio, we're getting millions and millions of dollars thrown into our election when it comes to issue number one on the ballot from a Swiss billionaire, right? So this is not something that's happening on a small scale. You look at these ballot initiatives like the abortion ballot initiatives that are going right now in Florida. It happened here in Ohio. It's happened in Nebraska. It's happened in Kansas. It's going on all over the place, and it's going to continue. Those are highly funded by foreign entities. So I guess my question is, if we're a nation that takes itself seriously, that we are a sacred democracy, that, it's supposed to be, we're as United States citizens supposed to have control over the direction of our nation, can we take all of that seriously when we have this type of foreign influence, foreign money, foreign boots on the ground in this case, swaying our elections? I think that continuously calls into question the actual integrity of our elections.
Yeah, and I think that's why you see calls from really both sides of the aisle now talking about, if this is a free and fair election. And I know Kamala's team already has representatives ready to challenge a close decision or whatever the case may be come election day. And it also builds the distrust within the American people that question election results. I mean, you have so much foreign money. We've opened early voting up to these vast periods where you have drop boxes and all these things. It's like it all adds to this fear that, and I think it's an understandable fear that something could go wrong here.
Yeah, and I think it's obviously the media's treatment of the American people has been incredibly unfair for our entire lives. But specifically on this issue, when it comes to trust in our elections, we were told, and for all of the moderators out there, I'm not making a statement one way or the other. So I just want this to be very clear that we're talking about trust here. When you take, like we talk about 2020, which was from the standpoint of how an election functions, was the most irregular election in American history, right? For a variety of reasons. You talked about the drop boxes, you talk about the extended early voting, you talk about mail-in ballots where they're literally mailing ballots to people's homes. There were factors thrown into that race, to that election, that had never factored into any election in human history. So people have the right to question their elections, right? In a free and fair society, it's okay to say, is this the right process to undertake? But we were told 2020 was the most safe and secure election of all time, right? So when you have people on the ground who are saying, okay, from a logical standpoint, we talked about conspiracy theories on the last episode. From a logical standpoint, does this policy, do these opening ups, bringing in all of these individuals, does this really allow for more and more loopholes and more shenanigans able to take place? And the logical answer is yes, even if they don't take place. So I think when it comes to how do we devise an election process, it's not just keeping in mind what's the best process, it's keeping in mind how do we establish the greatest amount of trust. And I think that's where our elites, the individuals making these decisions, have really gone off the rails, where that is even if they're well-intentioned, which is something that I find less than 1% chance of, even if they're well-intentioned, it totally loses the trust of the individual, and it's totally thrown out the window the consideration of the people who were just on the outside looking into this, right? When you have places like Detroit who threw up the pizza boxes and the cardboard boxes while people were counting ballots, right? That was something that, okay, how am I supposed to trust that? So from a visual aesthetic standpoint, like something like that, to the actual policy, people have reason to say, okay, I don't feel comfortable with this. But if you even say that, you're automatically called a conspiracy theory, which leads even more people to say, well, if you're attacking me for just having basic questions, then maybe I'm onto something.
Yeah. It's funny because I just ran across a news article from about 6 months ago or so that was from NBC that was Republicans have a conspiracy theory that that the Democrat Party will somehow reinstate a new candidate in front of Joe Biden. That's this crazy idea. There's no mechanism for this kind of change.
Absolutely insane.
And then here we are. But no, I mean, I think the question is like you have. It brings us to the point where you have. I remember all during the primary when they did exit polling data in Iowa and New Hampshire, and they would ask voters, Do you trust the 2020 election results? Do you trust it was a free and fair election? And by a huge majority, people said no.
Right.
And the talking heads on the TV, you can't believe this. These people must be just insane. But the fact is, like, the American people are at a point where they don't trust the system that's been put in place.
Yeah, and those same people who can't believe the distrust in our institutions, the distrust in our elections, they won't go one more step further to say, why is this, right? They will automatically go towards Donald Trump brainwashed all of these people, right? Donald Trump is a very influential figure. He is a very powerful political figure. He is somebody that has control over an entire movement, and that's very true. But he's not a hypnotizer, right? He wasn't able to just go out there and wave a wand to all these people when you talk about the majority in a lot of cases and say the election wasn't free, wasn't fair, wasn't done the right way. Those are people that are using their own faculties to reason with the situation. And the more that people go out there and say, no, you're totally wrong, Donald Trump's just brainwashing you, people are going to dig in more to their position. So then you create an even more dangerous scenario where even if you come forward with evidence that would prove that person wrong, you have beat them over the head so much, you have belittled them so much that they're not going to believe anything that you bring to the table. So that's why when I hear these people, the talking heads on TV that start talking about why is politics so divisive? Why are we so at war with one another? And it's like, have you looked in the mirror at all? Yeah. Have you done any kind of self-searching on maybe you contributed to this a little bit. And to me, I think what I continue to come back to is these people can't possibly be that dumb from the standpoint of that they see themselves totally innocent of this situation. I think that you are just seeing them push a narrative, and more people are understanding that I can't be trusting of anything that is said. And like we talked about last week, then they dig their heels into what is the opposite of what these people say.
Yeah. I think you made a good point about they tell you there's no evidence to support that there was any kind of interference or any kind of wrongdoing here. But then they never do go that extra step to like, how do you prove that? How do you prove it? Well, they just say, well, that the evidence doesn't exist. And the thing is, and I see on alternative media all the time, you see stories written by, I guess what you classify as alternative media, but like Daily Wire. I've seen stories about where there are more registered voters than there are people, in some of these counties. And it's like, okay, well, these stories are coming from somewhere.
Right. And they're not, to your point, when you talk about Daily Wire, that's a huge media organization with huge resources. So you're not even talking about some dude in their basement who makes up a story and puts it in a blog. You're talking about significant media sources that are talking about these things. So it's not even like it's fringe at this point. It is very much mainstream. So I believe that from just a principled standpoint, we have the right to question our elections and come to certain conclusions and ultimately call for certain policies that make our elections more secure. And there's a lot that we're going to get into that about in the rest of this show. I don't want to get into things too quickly. Right now, I want to kind of dive into where we stand at the state of this race. As I just see in the TV in front of me, Eminem coming out to campaign for Kamala Harris, which, I mean, even if somebody loves Eminem, and there's a few of his songs that, I like, they're on my Spotify, but if Eminem can change your mind on who you're going to vote for, that's a huge problem. Not to bounce too much out of the topic we're about to be in, but that's a problem. And I think actually we've seen some positive trends in the United States of people pushing out the opinions of the celebrity class and saying, okay, well, I'm not going to buy into this anymore, because if an actor or a musician or anybody who, like Eminem, how would they have any more basis to have an opinion than you do, right? They are not above you in any way. They might be a better rapper than you are, for whatever that's worth, and they might have more money than you do, but that doesn't qualify them to push any kind of political agenda. But I'm not going to get into all of that. I want to...
I mean, they just live in such a different world than your average American. I mean, their experience, they may have had hardships and tough times getting to where they are. But once you've lived in that bubble, once you've been that successful, made that kind of money, your life experience is vastly different than that of the average American. Yeah, and life experience is extremely valuable. I could talk about it from a personal perspective. Obviously, Eminem kind of grew up in a trailer park. There's all that. That's a very very well documented story. But I've heard so much over the years of my time in politics from politicians talking about, I grew up like this. I grew up like that. I know what it's like to live paycheck to paycheck. But then they'll go and they will push policies or fail to stand up to their end of the bargain that goes totally against what they would have told you from their life experience that may or may not be true. So I've kind of gotten to the point where it's like, I don't really care what your life experience is. I care more about what your track record is, because you look at somebody like Donald Trump, right? Donald Trump has never really struggled from a financial standpoint. I think that's pretty much true. He's certainly built up something, but he's never struggled. But I see somebody like Bernie Sanders or many other Democrat politicians who did kind of have times where they were not very well off, but would I take their policies? J.D. Vance.
Right. Yeah. Would I take their policies over policies like somebody like Donald Trump? No, not. So I think we have gone from, we have had this kind of emotional response to so many things as Americans. We're like, oh, I really like that person, so I'm going to vote for that person. Or I remember the thing with Obama was, there was all that polling that came out during that time frame when he was running against John McCain or Mitt Romney. It's like, who would you rather have a beer with? Yeah. Right. And that to me was always very frustrating, because why is that even coming into the equation of who you would rather hang out with? This is a job interview. It's like if I'm a boss and I'm interviewing somebody, I might like the person, but they might also be terrible at the job that I'm about to hire them for. And there might be somebody that I'm like, I don't want to see you outside of this 9 to 5, but you're really good at your job. Right?
Great at spreadsheets.
Right. So, so who am I actually going to trust to do the job? So Eminem distracted me. We're going to get back into what we're supposed to talk about, which is the state of the race. Okay. So this is an election coming on the heels of what we just talked about, an extremely irregular, unprecedented election in 2020. When we get into the actual polling data here, which is what I want to get into first, because just getting into some solid numbers before we get into some of the emotions and kind of other factors that are driving this election, it's no doubt that this is not going to be, when it comes to the standpoint of a popular vote, this is going to be a tight election. When you're looking at the polling data, I find it very interesting, and I'm always very hesitant to buy into polling data because we've seen it all over the map. We saw I can't remember if it was 2016 or 2020, but Quinnipiac polling had Trump losing Wisconsin by 19 points at one point, which was from a logical standpoint was never in the same universe of what was going to happen. Even if he was going to lose Wisconsin, it was going to be close. So you see some of those polling things that come out and you say, is this just some sort of suppression polling? Is this a bought and paid for poll? There's all those questions that come into our minds. But right now, we're looking at this week. We're coming in on, very close to the election here. This week in other elections, the most recent elections, you had Biden during this time frame. He was up 8 points. 8 points on Donald Trump. You had Hillary Clinton, who was up close to 6 points. Now, a lot of these numbers tend to tighten as you got days from the election, as you got closer and closer. But as of right now, in the Real Clear Politics average, Kamala Harris is up 1.1. So she is trailing Joe Biden essentially by 7 points nationally at this point. So I think it's pretty obvious to anybody who's rational, and obviously assuming things go smoothly, if Kamala Harris loses the national popular vote, there's absolutely no way that she can win from an electoral college standpoint. These numbers are growing more and more frightening for the Harris campaign. We're looking at some national polls that have Trump up as high as 3 points over Kamala Harris, which is, if you get to that point, you're talking about landslide territory from an electoral college standpoint. But if you look at all the top battleground states, Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Trump on the average is up in all of them. Now, everything here that I'm talking about is within the margin of error, but talking specifically about historical previous elections, if we're looking at polling, if any of these polls by any of these major polling firms are even in the same ballpark as what they were in 2020 or 2016 or elections before, it's hard to see a way that Donald Trump loses this election.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think if you listen to Democratic pollsters, they know when you're looking, especially at like national vote polling data, that if a Democrat isn't safely in the 50s, that they're in trouble.
Yeah.
I mean, we kind of expect that, especially over the last few election cycles, the Democrat will likely win the popular vote just because of the population centers in L.A., New York, those places. Yeah. But they know that if they're under 50, that they're in a dogfight.
Oh, yeah.
And to your point, I mean, you look at a lot of these battleground states right now. I mean, the fact that Trump has a lead in most of them. I think the other interesting thing is that when you look at like demographic polling, Trump is leading in independents, which is rare for a Republican. He's leading in Latinos, and he's siphoned off a significant portion of support of Black males. Mm-hmm. I think the last polling data I saw last night was that Kamala had 70%, essentially, was the polling data, which is off 15-20% off of what Democrats.
That would be a huge number for Donald Trump,
for sure,
from the Black male community. Now, I don't know if you saw when Trump was campaigning. I think he was at a rally. He's like, the black men, they love me. Black women, not so much. And I mean, I think, unintentionally at times one of the funniest people, Donald Trump, and just a pure comedian. But no, you're exactly right. And so when you start putting all these numbers together, and we're going to get into our predictions and everything later on in the show, it's getting worrisome for the Harris campaign. I think sometimes when I look at campaigns, regardless of if it's for president or it's a primary campaign or if you're looking at, a governor or whatever, a lot of the time what tells you even more than polling is the tone of the candidates. What's the tone of the campaign? I remember in 2016, there were some kind of outbursts that kind of took place from Hillary Clinton that really made it look like she wasn't comfortable. Like that there was something in the back of her mind that was gnawing at her when that was supposed to be an absolute cakewalk of an election. You go back to 2012 and you had the Mitt Romney comment about, you have this percentage, 47%, I think, percent of voters are not going to vote for me no matter what. And there was this kind of angst that you could feel from the campaign. And you could see the confidence of Barack Obama going into that election. You could see the confidence even of Joe Biden going into the previous election, which, again, we talked about all the things that kind of took place during that as well. But Trump's campaign in 2020 seemed more flustered, right? Certainly than it does now and what it seemed like in 2016. But just from a visual standpoint, I think sometimes tells a lot of what you can look at these candidates. And you're looking at Kamala Harris, who's getting in front of a microphone every chance she gets. And we can never again allow Donald Trump to sit behind the seal of President of the United States. Never again. And she's getting this kind of angrier and angrier tone, this more desperate feeling kind of tone. And at the same time, you're seeing Donald Trump work the drive-thru at McDonald's, right? Who's joking around with people coming through the line. He's talking about putting more salt on the fries. He's like, I'm going to come back here and work again. All these different things. And if you haven't seen those clips, you need to go back because they're hilarious. They're incredible. They're very charming, I think, as well. If you're looking at this objectively, it's a very charming thing for that Donald Trump, again, understanding the moment. But when I'm looking at these two campaigns, when I'm looking at Trump versus Harris, I am seeing two campaigns, one in the Harris campaign that seems very worried, very frantic, very desperate. They're doing more and more media to try to gain ground. It's not seeming to work for them. And I see the Trump campaign where J.D. Vance is going on the Theo Vaughn podcast. I see Donald Trump working the drive-thru at McDonald's. It just seems very loose, seems very excited, seems very positive, seems like there is a lot of confidence there. So again, that's me looking at this. Ken, are you seeing the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like you look at the polling data that would suggest Trump is doing well, but it feels like he's running his campaign like he's down a point.
Yeah.
Like he's the one that's getting after it every day.
It's energetic, though, I think, too.
Yeah, and I think recently in the headlines, we've had this whole idea that Trump is exhausted and this and that. And meanwhile, Kamala's taken days off the campaign trail.
Yeah.
And Trump has campaigned for something like 52 or 53 straight days since his last day off. So, and you know what? He probably is tired. Campaign is a busy time.
It's brutal.
Especially for a man that's near 80 years old. But he still is getting out to 2 and 3 different states a day, 2 and 3 different rallies a day. And he seems like he's having fun doing it. He's been poking fun at Kamala, whether it was at the Al Smith dinner, or I've worked at McDonald's 15 minutes longer than she ever did. Those types of things. I think yesterday he called her just flat out lazy. Lazy as hell. I think he called her because she was taking a day off 2 weeks before the election. He does seem to have a way about compartmentalizing and handling the campaign to where he's enjoying it this time around. And meanwhile, it seems like, especially with, Tulsi Gabbard, RFK coming over, it's becoming more more mainstream to accept Trump again.
Yeah.
And it seems like on the same side now, the Democrat Party is going back to the old reliable, which is he's a threat to democracy. You're a misogynist if you don't vote for a woman.
Yeah.
And
calling Kamala Harris lazy is a racist trope.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So it's just this same old, bag of tricks. And meanwhile, the Trump campaign just continues to cruise.
So you touched on something really important, which I think is Donald Trump's energy right now. And I think it's very illustrative of his whole life, right? I don't think he would be even capable of taking a day off, right? He's just that kind of person. And there's very few people like this. If you go back, read about Teddy Roosevelt, he was the exact same way, where it was anytime he couldn't even fathom the idea of downtime, because downtime is when all the demons kind of came home to roost for somebody like Teddy Roosevelt, whereas if he wasn't doing something politically, if he wasn't reading, he was out wrangling cattle, right? And I think that's the type of person Donald Trump is in many ways a throwback person in that way, where he is just, for all of his flaws, he is absolutely relentless in pursuit of his goals. And I think that's a very admirable trait and something that we've really lost in our society and something that's really good to encourage. But there are obviously always lines there where, how does this affect your relationships? How does this affect your family, your children? There's always all these considerations to have. But I think you look at somebody like Donald Trump at, like you said, right around 80 years old, and just seeing somebody with that type of energy, I don't think that will be something that goes away till the day that he dies.
No. And it's funny. I mean, it's what he said when he called her lazy. He was like, a day off? The hell?
Yeah. Yeah.
Who's heard of a day off?
But I think, he's right in pointing that out. It's like, hey, we're 2 weeks away from an election here, and you're taking a day off. Like, the way his brain is wired and the way many people are, you can't even fathom that. Like, I remember my dad would get really sick, and he would still go to work selling cars, and Kamala Harris is running for president of the United States, and she's taking a day off. It's kind of very indicative of the whole, take a mental health day, or got to take time for yourself. And I can see Kamala Harris very much as that type of person. Joe Biden's been taking so many naps in the White House, maybe that has kind of infected her way of doing things. But I think that right now, if you were to just have no idea of the polls, no idea of anything statistically, and you just looked at the tone of the campaigns, you would feel like Trump is kind of riding a wave towards victory just by the body language, by the emotion behind the campaign, and you would feel like the Kamala Harris campaign is getting, at the very least, very tense about the outcome right now. For no other reason would you pull out somebody like Eminem to start campaigning for you with Barack Obama. That's a very great signal of, we need to bring out Eminem in Detroit. We're not feeling too good about Michigan. So, right. But I want to get into something very, very serious right now that, we've heard so much. We've lived through this life of this time period of just these evil Republican election deniers that have, the Republicans who almost overthrew the government, who, stormed the Capitol, who refused to certify the election. I just want to play some clips of these just absolutely awful Republicans denying election results.
The objection is in writing, and I don't care.
There are still legitimate concerns over the integrity of our elections.
When they cast the ballot on an electronic voting machine, that there is no paper trail.
But constantly shifting vote tallies in Ohio have led to additional loss of confidence by the public.
Objected to the counting of the electoral votes of the state of Ohio.
Electoral votes cast by Florida were cast by electors not lawfully certified.
I object to the certificate from the state of Alabama. The electors were not lawfully certified.
People are horrified by the overwhelming evidence.
Section 18, Title 3.
I object to the certificate from the state of Georgia.
I object to the certificate from the state of North Carolina.
Stacey Abrams doesn't win in Georgia. They stole it.
And I will not concede. You can even become the nominee, and you can have the election stolen from you. He knows he's an illegitimate president.
I have an objection to the electoral votes. The objection isn't.
Oh, wait, those are all Democrats. Sorry. I totally would have thought that every Democrat of all time was very graceful in their acceptance of election results, except for anybody who's been living outside of underneath a rock for the last several years. You've seen this time and time again. So we have been told for the last several years, right, since Donald Trump and many others on the right said 2020 was a little bit suspicious, that you're an election denier, you're a horrible person, you're a threat to democracy, all of these different things. And now we're seeing the roles reversed, as they always are anytime a Republican comes close to winning. There is this tremendous article coming from the New Republic, which is a leftist outlet. And this was from October 21st. Republicans are cheating again, but now it's worse than ever. Trump is supercharging the GOP's age-old penchant for skullduggery in presidential elections, which, great word, skullduggery. But you're seeing these articles now popping out about how there's actually a threat to this election, that Donald Trump may steal this election. In the New Republic, there's another tweet, how Republicans win presidential elections. According to the factual record, they cheat. This has been true in most elections in recent American history. This is a pattern that has been around through the Bush years, through now the Trump years, where anytime a Republican wins, there's cheating, there's election meddling. In 2016, it was Russia, 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 right? It was the Russia, as Trump would say, the Russia collusion hoax, right? There wasn't any kind of evidence, but it was Russia spent like $500 on some Facebook ads, and that influenced the election. And I think that's why, as we talked about earlier, these things happen like it happened in 2020, where we saw the lawsuits, where we saw a true campaign against what happened in the 2020 election. And all of these Democrats came out and said, this is just an abhorrent, evil threat to our norms and our traditions. This cannot be tolerated. And all of us said, wait, Hillary Clinton still hasn't accepted her loss from 2016. What are you talking about? And so for many of us, this was just another kind of notch for us to say, we're not going to take any of you guys seriously.
I'm not even sure Al Gore has accepted that he lost his election.
No. No, he hasn't. And he's, between inventing the internet and not losing the 2000 presidential election, I mean, he's got quite a thing going for him. And I think we're at that point where I think the world was supposed to end by now, right?
Oh, yeah.
I think we're well past
multiple times. What do they call it? Midnight or whatever? Midnight hour? Well,
I remember there used to be, if you went on Rush Limbaugh's website back in the day, there used to be an Al Gore Armageddon counter.
Yes, there was.
That was at the bottom of the page, and that hit zero.
Long time ago.
a long time ago. But you're not just getting this from left-wing media outlets. You're getting this, and you alluded to this earlier, you're getting this from Kamala Harris herself, talking about the fact that she has teams in these swing states ready to go to challenge the election results if they feel that's appropriate.
We've got 2 weeks to go, and I'm very much grounded in the present in terms of the task at hand, and we will deal with election night and the days after as they come, and we have the resources and the expertise and the focus on that as well.
So you have teams ready to go? Is that what you're saying? Are you thinking about that as a possibility?
Of course.
So, of course, right? Why would there be any question that we would challenge the election results? And from a principled standpoint, of course she would, right? Why would you not? But why would both campaigns not have the legal resources in place?
Yeah. No, I mean, it is funny when we're told over and over again how safe and this election process is, that there's no way that it could be disrupted or confounded. Yeah, I mean, it's a perfect system. Why would you even need teams in place to question the election results? Because there's no way it can be interfered with.
Exactly. And that's why, again, why we have no trust in our institutions. But, in a free, fair, functioning society, if we were in a sane society, of course you'd have these things in place that, you feel something wasn't right. You're going to challenge that. You're going to make sure things went through the correct process. But, we were told that just the fact of challenging anything, or even thinking about, you don't even have to say it out loud, even thinking internally about the fact that an election might not be perfect, you should go to jail for that, is essentially what we've been told over the last 3.5 years.
And the funny thing is these elections are all administered differently. They're done by the state. Like the Secretary of State essentially outlines like how we're going to handle election day, how we're going to count votes, like what teams are working on what. And every state has a different Secretary of State, and they can all make their own rules for how they're going to count votes, how they're going to tally things, how they're going to communicate vote totals to the media and those things. It's like, it's this hugely complex process, and I don't understand why we as Americans aren't brought in with more transparency into really what it looks like. If you're going to tell me it's so safe and it's so impenetrable. Like, explain to me how. Why is there not stories on CNN and Fox and MSNBC every day talking about here's why we believe in the integrity of these elections, because they're doing X, Y, and Z. You see some fringe stories here and there about, like their machines aren't connected to the internet or whatever else it may be. But like, why do we not have just a very like well thought out, written outline and understanding of exactly what's going to happen in every election?
Yeah.
And it's because it is this very wide net, this complex process, because it's different in every state. And we're just supposed to believe that somehow it all works.
Right. So getting into the actual outcome here of the election, we're going to get into some predictions here shortly. What I want to kind of play around is and I'm going to start with you. What if Trump wins? How do you see the next 4 years playing out? Policy, the tone, what does the nation look like in 4 years? Do you think that it looks any different than Trump's first 4 years? I'd be interested to get your take first, and I'll give mine.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think we'll love mean tweets and cheap gas. I think this election is so unique because it's unlike any election we've seen in our lifetime, because you have a guy that's done it before and essentially the vice president of the current sitting president. So you kind of have a really good idea of what both candidates would do should they win. To me, a Trump presidency looks like a return to some semblance of normalcy. I think the first thing you start to see is probably America leading the world again, thinking about ending, or trying to bring an end to the conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza in some way that makes sense. And I think Trump will. I mean, I say he's going to do it on day one. I would say probably by the end of his first year, I believe that Donald Trump would put an end to that. I think again, as evidenced by his first term in office, we didn't have these kinds of skirmishes around the world that you're seeing under the lack of leadership of Joe Biden. So I think that's the first thing. You start to see America take reign of leading the world again, and some of these silly things going on around the world, and the nonsense stops. I also think the nonsense on college campuses stop with the Hezbollah and the anti-Israeli protesters and things, because I don't think Donald Trump has any trouble thinking about, like, I want to put the screws to these universities in terms of funding, or I'll call my governor and get the National Guard involved.
Yeah.
Like, you're not going to stop students from going into class because of their religion. Like, these are just things that shouldn't happen in America.
Yeah.
I think you're going to see moderation on social issues. Like, we've talked a lot about, like, this Republican platform looks very different than Republican platforms of the past in terms of where Trump sits on things like gay marriage and abortion. And, I think that, so you start to take some of that out of the dialogue of everyday Americans, which probably is a good thing because it's such a heightened and incendiary point right now. And then I think you start to see the healing of the economy. I think, sound economic policy drives better results. You start to reduce harmful, unnecessary regulation. I saw Elon Musk was just talking about, kind of riffing off the cuff about how with his Starship, they had to do a study to determine whether or not, when this thing came back to Earth, whether it might land on a shark. Because we wouldn't want that to happen. And he's like, we had to spend thousands of dollars putting together some study that, like, I'm like, the ocean's big. It's possible. Yeah, you could land on a shark. So I think you start to reduce some of this needless regulation, freeing up capital for businesses to reinvest and grow and hire more workers at livable wages. So again, I think all that is just like a return to some sense of normalcy, when we've had, since 2020, this bizarre world where we went from everybody's wearing masks in their own cars, and inflation is rampant and out of control, and people can't afford groceries, you can't afford cars, you can't afford houses, and interest rates are skyrocketing through the roof. Like, I think it calms the storm. To your point earlier, like, I don't know that Donald Trump is the silver bullet that fixes everything. I think there's still a lot of work to be done to get to that point. But I think Donald Trump at least starts to pave the way for the healing and the return to normalcy.
Yeah. You and I have talked before that Donald Trump, on most issues, he's more of a moderate, right? So there are people like me out there who are about as conservative gets, that there's what I would want his presidency to look like, and there's what I think his presidency will look like. And I think you hit on a lot of things there of what it probably will look like. And I think to define it in a lot of ways, it's actually Donald Trump's role in many ways is probably bringing America closer to the middle. Because right now, across the country, in terms of policy and how we interact, we are really more of a center-left nation, right? In many ways. You have a lot of states that are far left, but even like here in the state of Ohio, with a governor like Mike DeWine's a center-left person. And maybe outside of really economic policy for the most part, he finds himself on the left on a lot of issues. Abortion, he's more on the right. But I think what you're going to see is a lot more of what I talked about in this last segment. You're going to see a lot more of this whole crowd on the Democrat on the left who talked about standards and norms and grace and our Constitution and our sacred democracy and all of these things just go completely off the rails. I think you're going to see a lot of the attacks like you saw throughout his first presidency to try to derail any accomplishments. I think you're going to see a backlash from the far leftists in our cities like LA and New York that I hope doesn't lead to any kind of violence or unrest, but I think you're going to see a lot of separating among our states. I think you're going to see a lot of what Donald Trump does, and I think who he is as a person, is he's going to get us out of things like the Paris Climate Accords, right? He's going to get us out of these globalist initiatives that steal our sovereignty as a nation and ultimately don't even achieve what they set out to achieve. He's going to rein in a lot of, I think, our intervention abroad. I don't think he's going to reduce spending, or I don't think he's going to launch a deportation initiative. I don't think it's going to be nearly at the scale of what I would think is needed. But I think he's going to, like you said, on all, whether it's immigration, whether it's the wars abroad, whether it's our climate craziness, whether it's these social issues, I think his presidency is going to be a lot of reining things in and paving the way for what the future is going to be a battle over, which is going to be, is this country going to go left or is it going to go right? I think Donald Trump kind of reins in the craziness where that conversation can really be had. And looking at our states, I think what you're going to see over the course of a Donald Trump presidency is you're going to see leftist states go further left, and you're going to see right-wing states potentially go further right. And I think what that sets up for is essentially what's going to be the battle over the next 50 to 100 years in the United States, which is, can all of these states that are continuously growing more and more separate in terms of our beliefs, in terms of our principles, the way we relate to one another, will those states be able to live in a functioning society, a mutual society together? Will we see a 50-state United States of America moving forward? Because I know it's a radical thing to say, like a civil war is going to break out, and I don't think that's going to be the case from a violence standpoint or anything like that. But you do see our states separating further and further. So how are we going to interact with each other as people? That's going to be, I think, the question after the Trump presidency and beyond is, can we still relate to one another? Can we still have a coherent 50-state United States of America? Or is this long-term experiment coming to some sort of end or some sort of combustion ultimately? I think those are the questions that we're really going to see asked over the Donald Trump years, because you're going to see these states like California, like New York, fight so hard against any kind of Donald Trump policy.
Yeah, I mean, I think what is going to help drive that conversation probably to the right is that you're going to, I mean, like California and New York are in trouble. No one wants to do business there.
Yeah.
Like, what are these states going to have? Like, people are leaving these states in droves and trying to go to more free, prosperous states, red states. Mm-hmm. And so you're going to be left with these very small vocal minorities in these places, while the rest of the world looks a lot more like the Midwest.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, you kind of alluded to like this Civil War topic, and I don't know that like you said, that's coming down the pike. But I think it is fair to say that like there is some semblance of a cultural civil war going on.
Exactly.
You have these ideas that clash, and they clash hard, and people are passionate about these issues, and it leads to divisiveness and hate, and no one wants to even have the conversation, and that's why, again, this like election is so interesting, because we've gotten so far from the conversation of even just what's right and what's wrong, and it's just so tribal, and so, you know, which team are you on? Which team do you support? I mean, you mentioned the national debt there. It's like, when have we had an election where no one cares about spending?
Yeah.
Period. I mean, it just doesn't matter.
It's not even a conversation. It's not a legitimate conversation.
The national debt is upwards of $30 trillion now. I mean, when I was in middle school, it was like 12.
Yeah. It's a footnote in anything, and I think that you talk about California and New York and these hyper liberal states, and you're seeing people flee those states. You're seeing businesses flee those states. But what's interesting about the whole thing with people fleeing and businesses fleeing and them hurting financially and all of this stuff is it hasn't backed them off of their positions, of their policies really at all. And that's why I used to kind of be a firm believer in like the free market's going to sort things out, and you're going to see these corporations get less woke and because they're going to start hurting you financially. But look at Disney, right? Look at these mammoth corporations that have hurt financially, but have really, they might have alluded to backing off or put it some sort of, you know, a soft backing off. But really, a lot of these corporations, a lot of these states, these government entities, they have lost money and continue to go down that path. And they are still refusing to back off of those initiatives. So I've kind of, the conclusion I've come to is so many of these individuals in these states, they have a religious type adherence to their worldview, right? And that's where I get into the whole conversation, which is a conversation for another day, that everybody worships something. But that's really what we're battling here. And I think sometimes we try to simplify this into some kind of policy battle that if we just, you know, propose better policy, they'll come around or they'll see the mistakes that they've made. But I think you really get into this religious devotion that a lot of leftists have to their cause, to their policies, and there's nothing of this world or that I can do or that Donald Trump could do as president that is going to bring them off of that ledge. And I think that's really going to be the story of the next 4 years and beyond. All right, so flip the coin. DEFCON 5, worst case scenario. Kamala Harris is president of the United States. Tampon Tim is vice president of the United States. What does America look like in 4 years? What are we experiencing over these next 4 years? Possibly 8 years. Ken, you started again.
Tampons in all the bathrooms, that's for sure. Look, I think we've seen, like I said, we've seen what kind of both candidates will do. I think the interesting thing about Kamala is she keeps saying, I'm not Joe Biden, and it's not going to be a continuation of Joe Biden's policies. But then I'm left with, well, then what will you do? And the only thing I can go back to is kind of, as you've talked about, is like, what does your track record say that you'll do?
Yeah.
And this woman ran a campaign for president in 2019 or whatever for the 2020 election, and in 11 months got less and less popular every month because she was so far left of even like the Bernie Sanderses of the party. So look, I think you'll see a lot of what you've seen over the last 3.5 years, which is the continued high prices of goods, necessities. I have no idea what I keep hearing this $25,000 housing. I don't know if it's a credit or cash assistance. She kind of bounces back and forth between which one it is. And I'm like, these are two vastly different ideas. I saw part of her plan for attracting black male voters was regulation of cryptocurrency. I was like, I don't have any black friends that care about regulating the crypto market, but I guess that's coming. But so I think you'll see in terms of like economically, and foreign policy, like the same kind of weak economic policy, the same kind of weak foreign policy where America leads from behind. And then I think you start to see this devolution of where we are as a country on social issues, because I think when push comes to shove, she's going to fall back into what she's comfortable doing. And I know she's saying a lot of things in interviews right now where I asked her a question about transgender and whether they should be given medical assistance, these things. And she said, well, I think we should follow the law. Well, that's not an answer.
No.
So, at the end of the day, you're going to revert to, where your values are. And she continues to say her values haven't changed. So I have to believe that we're going to see more of the extreme leftist policy out of her, which is, men and women's sports, it's gun grabbing, it's green policy, Green New Deal initiatives, lack of producing energy here in America, buying it from other countries, this arbitrary push toward electric everything, which, again, at the end of the day makes no sense because, one, your grid can't handle it, and two, there's still fossil fuels that are creating electricity. And then this whole idea that she's going to reduce the cost of everything through price controls. You take the most socialistic, communist element,
which has never worked in history
ever. That's not a thing, right?
Not one example.
Yeah, I think you see, again, just kind of from an economic and a foreign policy, just a weak leadership that we've had for the last 3.5 years. I think that continues, and I think you see just this slow disintegration of traditional American values into the Kamala world, which is a little scary.
Well, I think it's really important to be clear about Kamala Harris that nobody likes her. There is not a human being that likes Kamala Harris. There are a lot of human beings that hate Donald Trump. And I think you could say the same for Joe Biden in 2020, where the vote skewed more towards I need to get Donald Trump out of office than I need a guy like Joe Biden in office to make my life better. But I think kind of what you're getting at is that if Kamala Harris wins, she's going to revert back to what she is at heart, which is a pretty hardcore leftist, right? She's somebody that in her personal life, the reason that she's gotten to where she is in politics is sleeping her way to the top and forming relationships that way. So, her moral character isn't great. So she's talked about in the past legalizing sex work. She's talked about in the past, giving the transgender surgeries for inmates, taxpayer funded. And there's those great Trump ads that are Kamala is for they, them, Trump is for you, which I think is hilarious. But I think what she will see is, we talk about so much of her. She's been here in this place for 3.5 years. Why hasn't she done any of the things that she's saying she's going to do now? Which obviously shows that she has no true intent on accomplishing those things. I think what you'll see is not just a continuation of the past 4 years, past 3.5 years. You're going to see a little bit more gas, a little bit more pedal to the metal, where you're going to see the leftist establishment with Kamala Harris as the figurehead really see this, if they're supported by the voters, see it as license to ramp it up, kind of this mandate from the voters that, okay, we made their lives terrible. We made groceries and housing unaffordable. We flooded their nation with foreign nationals. We started all these wars and taking part of these wars around the globe. We are less prosperous. We are less free. We are less safe. All of these, crime is up exponentially, all of these different things, and they still elected us. It kind of gives you, as that person who's putting in forth those policies, a kind of confidence to say, wow, we can take this even further. Yeah. And I think that's the real danger in a Kamala Harris presidency, isn't just that things will continue to be bad, but that they will get worse because they feel they will have the license to ramp up these policies. And as a result, we will have less and less recourse to be able to get out of this mess. So going now, I think we all know what a Kamala Harris presidency is going to look like in many ways. Getting into what we think is going to happen, and this isn't what we want to happen. This isn't, I'm not going to throw out, this is exactly what I want to happen, and this is what's going to happen. This is what I genuinely think is going to happen. I'll put a few caveats in here as we go. I'm not, an election expert, as we always bring on these election experts that are constantly wrong. I don't know how many times Karl Rove has been wrong about things, but he's always trotted out there as like the guy who can do no wrong when it comes to elections. But I'm going to throw my electoral map up on the screen here so that you can take a look at my expectation. So my map's going to look pretty similar to kind of what we talked about early in the show, which is the fact that Donald Trump in the polls right now is leading in every major swing state. And based on the polling that you see in the past, I can't imagine a pathway for Kamala Harris to be able to overcome the deficit that she's seeing in relation to Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton, even back in 2016. I think you see Trump win very close victories in Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania. I think he carries North Carolina. I think he carries Georgia. I think he carries Arizona. I even think he carries Nevada in this case, because what you're seeing here is very interesting, because for the first time, you're actually seeing Donald Trump outperform a lot of these Republican candidates in Senate and House races. So I'm throwing predictions at you right now. I think across the board, you're going to see Donald Trump. I don't think he's going to win the popular vote, but I think it's going to be closer than it has been over the last couple elections. I think you're going to see a slim Senate majority. I think you're going to see Bernie Moreno win here in Ohio, flipping the seat for Sherrod Brown. I think you're going to see Montana flip. West Virginia is going to flip. I think you're going to see probably a 52-48 Senate majority. But it's very interesting because I think you see, like in Arizona, you see it in North Carolina, you're seeing it in Pennsylvania, you're seeing Michigan, Wisconsin. The Republican candidate polling wise is trailing Donald Trump anywhere from like 5 to 6 or more points in a lot of cases. And it's very interesting because in the past, Republicans largely were outperforming Donald Trump. Donald Trump was actually a drain on the ticket for some of these candidates. And in this case, it looks like they're leaning on Donald Trump to drag them across the finish line. I think in the House races, you're going to see the Republicans maintain a pretty slim majority in the House, but ultimately gain control of all 3 chambers, which really gives Donald Trump in this case that window of opportunity to be able to get things done he wants to get done. Because in all likelihood, in 2 years, that House is going to flip back to Democrats like it always does. But my caveat on all of this is a CNN article, again, I'm going back to, election experts raise fresh alarms about vote counting delays and chaos in battleground states. You had the election experts, the head of the election panel on Fox News, saying that he's going to expect around a 4-day delay for election results. And it's just, the longer that it drags out, the less confident I will feel in Donald Trump winning this election. Because I feel like if it's very cut and dry, that there's no room for any shenanigans or legal activities, that I think Donald Trump's going to win this election. But the longer it drags out, the less I feel that's going to be the case. And, you know, I think that the public reaction ultimately to this is you're going to see it across party lines. You're going to see in the deep blue states, I think you're going to see a huge backlash against Donald Trump winning, much like you saw in 2016. You're probably going to get some great memes out of it, but hopefully no business owners see their windows shattered or anything like that. We're obviously praying for, you know, safety for everybody when it comes to something of this magnitude. And I think from a nation standpoint, I think you will see ultimately a lot of people's blood pressure come down a little bit, thinking that there's going to be some change moving forward. But I think you're going to see a continued divide among the population. Ken, am I crazy? Am I spot on here, or what's your take?
I think you're close. So you have the blue wall completely obliterated there.
I do in this case, and I, you know, I'm basing it off of, like I said in the beginning, the tone, but mostly the polling data, because if these polls are in the same universe as in accuracy as they were in 2020 or 2016, this will be the map, right? It's just really dependent on, do these polls hold up similar to how they did the last few election cycles?
Yeah, no, that's fair. I mean, I think if you look at our maps, ours are pretty close there. I think I dropped Michigan out of the blue wall territory just because you can't trust Michigan for anything. But that's because I'm from Ohio. But no, I do think, again, the polling data, like we said, if the Democrats aren't polling in the 50s, they know there's a problem.
Yeah.
And if you look across the board right now and Real Clear Politics, all these different ones, I mean, Trump is leading in most of these battleground states. It's going to take some kind of insurmountable gaffe, some October surprise to change things, I think, at this point in the race. I have a hard time believing there's that many independent or like toss-up voters left that are undecided. I think you're 2 weeks to the day, and I can't imagine the polling data changing all that much. Obviously, everything that's been polled is within the margin of error, but I just don't know that Kamala is performing well enough in any of these states. And I think she will win the popular vote. I just don't think that she's polling well enough to have the margins necessary to win in a lot of these swing states. And really where you look at states that are leaning Republican, leaning Democrat at this point in the race, Donald Trump has a lead there. And he really only has to knock off like a Pennsylvania and a Nevada, and you have the presidency.
Yeah,
I think he'll win more than that, but he's not. His path to get there is far easier than hers.
Yeah, no, I think you're definitely right. Based on the polling, based on everything we're seeing, I think he has the more legitimate pathway, and she's going to have to upset him. If you actually look at what the Republicans are doing, they're actually expanding their map, right? They've expanded their map throughout this election season, and they're expanding the voter demographics that they're going after. So I think that is a sign too that, you know, Harris and their team, they're trying to hang on to their base, right? The reliable voters. And so I just think that at this point, like you said, even with an October surprise, unless it's something that is just astronomically insane, I don't think that it knocks many people off whatever side of the fence that they're on at this point. I feel like at this point, the vast majority of votes are baked in, and people have been experiencing what they've experienced over the last 4 years. They experienced Donald Trump, and I think really it makes it a pretty clear choice of what you want. And for that reason, I really don't see the polling data shifting too much over the closing days of this campaign. So
I do think it'll be Thanksgiving before we know who the president is, before everything is settled.
I pray that's not the case, but I agree with you. I think that this is going to drag on, and not to get back into this, but again, when you're talking about trusting in a system, trusting your elections are fair, we are more technologically advanced than we ever have been in history. Obviously, our voting is more advanced. Our machines are more advanced. We have all these systems in place. We used to count all of these by hand in a night, right? So at what point are these systems benefiting us? If it's such a burden to count them all by hand, how did we do it in a tenth of the time that it takes now to feed these through machines and tabulate everything and all of this craziness? So I think that if there's any potential for unrest and panic, it's because of the fact that we don't feel confident one way or the other on either side that we're going to get a truly fair result out of this. And I'm not saying that that's the case, but I'm saying that's the way people feel. And that's simply not acceptable when it comes to this. So, but regardless of any of that, we got Donald Trump winning this election. You heard it here first. No need to even tune in to Fox News or anything on election night. We got the map. We got it for you. We leaked the map early. So we're going to call it right there for Donald Trump. We think he's winning the election, but regardless, make sure you're getting out there to vote and do your duty as an American citizen. So Ken, thank you so much for joining me here again today.
Anytime, my friend.
And now we are going to get into our uncomfortable truth. So today for our uncomfortable truth, we're going to get partially into what is true, partially what is a sense of urgency that we need to instill on this election. The truth is, you may not get another chance to get this right. This election, like we've talked about before, maybe it's the most important election of our lifetime, maybe it's not. But regardless of that, it's going to influence greatly what the future of this republic looks like. We have estimated studies that by the year 2040, there are going to be 82.2 million foreign-born individuals living in the United States. That's a study done by the Center for Immigration Studies. We've seen 5.1 million come in over the last 2 years, which is a record for the United States. More than twice the population of California are we looking at coming into the United States, living in the United States by the year 2040. This is coming on the heels of reports coming out that we are setting record paces of citizenship approvals. 4.9 months it now takes, as opposed to nearly a full year that was the record pace set just 3 years ago. We have talked about greatly as a society the great replacement conspiracy theory, right? Conspiracy theory. You're seeing all these articles that are out that the Great Replacement Theory is a conspiracy theory, it's a racist theory, it's this, it's that. But you'll see studies at the same time, you'll see articles at the same time saying that white Americans are set to become a minority by 2050. Now, the message I'm giving is not to white voters, but it is to our native-born American voters. Your vote, your power over the direction of our nation is decreasing by the day. Just look at California, a Republican stronghold for nearly 40 years, right? The home of Ronald Reagan. But ironically, it was Ronald Reagan's amnesty and immigration increasing policies that led to now California that we see today, the far leftist stronghold that is really the epicenter for immigration and illegal immigration that has turned it seemingly blue for eternity. If Kamala Harris wins and these trends are allowed to proceed or even increase, you may never get another chance to regain your country. We're seeing the goal here. You're seeing the replacement of the voter base all across this country by shipping in foreign individuals, both legally and illegally, and citizenship taking place at a breakneck speed. So one can only jump to the conclusion that, hey, they're trying to dilute our vote. They're trying to make sure that we don't have the ability to reverse their policies. And that is the truth of what this presidential election means in 2024. You need to get out there and vote like your country depends on it, like your future of your vote depends on it, like the future of your children's vote depends on it, because you may not get this opportunity again. Thank you for joining me for Man in the Arena. I'm Jonah Schultz. Make sure you go out and vote like your country depends on it, because it does, and we'll see you on the other side.
If I can change, я думаю, что каждый тоже изменился. And you can change. Вы можете измениться.